Marcus Bennett stood at the rusted gate of Redstone Quarry for the first time in 15 years, his son's small hand tucked inside his own, and realized he'd been holding his breath since the county road turned to gravel 2 miles back. The chain that once locked the entrance hung broken, swaying slightly in the October wind, and beyond it, the deep-cut walls of limestone rose like the ribs of some ancient beast his grandfather had carved open and left to weather alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daddy, is this where you lived? 6-year-old Owen asked, his voice small against the silence that pressed down from the surrounding hills. Sometimes, Marcus said, which was the simplest version of the truth he could manage. He pushed the gate open with his shoulder, metal shrieking against metal, and they stepped onto land that had been in the Bennett family for 4 generations, until the state had decided Marcus wasn't safe here anymore and scattered his childhood across 12 different homes in 3 counties. He was 12 when they took him away. Now he was 33, a single father working double shifts at a meatpacking plant in Millerton, living in a rented duplex with walls so thin Owen had learned to whisper his nightmares. Marcus's ex-wife had left when Owen was 2, said she couldn't do the poverty thing, couldn't watch Marcus destroy himself trying to be something he wasn't. She'd wanted a man with a future. Marcus had wanted to survive. The letter had arrived 6 weeks ago, forwarded 3 times before it found him. Your grandfather, Raymond Bennett, passed in his sleep. Estate to be settled. Presence required. The lawyer's office smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet when Marcus finally made the appointment, Owen coloring with broken crayons in the waiting room while a man named Gerald Hoffner explained that Raymond had left everything to Marcus. The quarry, the equipment, the house, and the debt. $73,000 owed to the bank, 6 months to settle or lose it all to foreclosure. Why me? Marcus had asked. He never came for me. 15 years in the system and he never once tried to get me back. Hoffner had adjusted his glasses, uncomfortable. I can't speak to that, Mr. Bennett. I can only tell you what's in the will. He wanted you to have it. What you do with it is your choice. Marcus had walked out without deciding anything, but the number had followed him home, whispered itself during his shifts, lingered in the spaces between Owen's questions about why they couldn't afford new shoes. 73,000 might as well have been 73 million. He'd come here today not because he had a plan, but because he needed to see it one last time before he signed the papers that would hand it over to the bank. Needed to understand what his grandfather had valued more than him. The quarry spread out before them now, a vast amphitheater cut into the hillside, its walls striped in layers of cream and rust and gray. Water had pooled at the bottom, 30 feet down, green and still as glass. The old derrick stood skeletal against the sky, and beyond it, the processing shed sagged under the weight of its own tin roof. Everything looked smaller than Marcus remembered, and infinitely more tired. It's like a castle, Owen said, awe creeping into his voice as he looked at the sheer limestone walls. It's a hole in the ground, Marcus replied, but without the bitterness he'd expected to feel. His grandfather had spent 40 years here, pulling stone from the earth, selling it to builders and landscapers and anyone who needed something solid to build on. Raymond Bennett had been a quiet man, thick-shouldered and hard, his hands permanently stained with limestone dust. Marcus's mother, Raymond's only child, had left the quarry at 18 and never looked back, married a man who drank too much and died in a car wreck when Marcus was 9. She'd lasted another 2 years before her own demons caught up with her. Marcus had been 11 when she overdosed. 12 when Child Protective Services came to the quarry and found him living in conditions they called neglectful. Raymond hadn't fought them. Had just stood in the doorway of the little house, arms crossed, watching them load Marcus into the sedan with his garbage bag of clothes, and said nothing. No promises. No fight. Nothing. Mr. Bennett didn't contest the removal, the caseworker had told him later, as if that explained everything. He felt you'd have better opportunities elsewhere. But Marcus had spent 15 years in elsewhere, and it had taught him exactly one thing: nobody fights for you unless you're worth the trouble. They walked along the quarry's edge, Marcus keeping Owen away from the crumbling lip where rainwater had eroded the soil. The house sat 100 yards past the main pit, a small clapboard structure that had once been white but now wore its bare wood like a confession. The porch steps were rotted through on one side, and someone had boarded up the windows, probably the bank after Raymond died. "Can we go inside?" Owen asked. "Maybe," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he wanted to. The house held too many memories of silence, of eating canned soup across the table from a man who looked at him like he was a problem that had no good solution. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind the house, the equipment shed still stood, its doors hanging open. Marcus could see the old caterpillar inside, the one Raymond had babied like a second child, keeping it running long past when he should have replaced it. Tools hung on the walls in ordered rows, each one cleaned and returned to its place, the kind of care Raymond had never extended to people. "Stay close," Marcus told Owen as they approached the shed. The afternoon light slanted through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust that moved like living things in the still air. The smell hit him immediately, oil and rust and limestone dust, the smell of his childhood, of summers spent hauling equipment and winters watching Raymond disappear into the quarry before dawn. The caterpillar sat silent, its yellow paint faded to the color of old corn. Marcus ran his hand along the treads, remembering how Raymond had taught him to drive it when he was 10, patient for the first and only time Marcus could remember, explaining the gears and levers with something that might have been pride. "You've got the hands for it," Raymond had said. "Bennett hands. Good for working stone." But then the caseworker had come, and Marcus had learned his hands were good for other things, stacking shelves, flipping burgers, whatever kept him fed in the homes that rotated him through their doors like inventory. Owen had wandered to the back of the shed, drawn to something Marcus couldn't see. "Dad, there's a door here." Marcus joined him, finding a heavy wooden door set into what he'd always assumed was just the back wall of the shed. It was secured with a new padlock, bright steel against weathered wood, completely out of place among the rust and decay of everything else. "That wasn't here before," Marcus said, more to himself than Owen. He pulled the lawyer's packet from his jacket, shuffling through papers until he found the key ring Hoffner had given him. 3 keys, house, equipment shed, and one smaller key he'd assumed was for a lockbox or filing cabinet. The small key slid into the new padlock like it had been made yesterday. The door opened onto darkness and a set of wooden stairs leading down. Cool air rose from below, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something that made Marcus's pulse quicken without understanding why. "Can we go down?" Owen asked, already starting forward. "No." Marcus caught his son's shoulder. "Not yet. Not until I know what's down there." "Is it treasure?" "It's probably just storage, buddy. Old equipment or files." But the padlock had been new, installed recently, maybe by Raymond in his final months, or perhaps by the bank's assessors. And if it was just storage, why the secrecy? Why wasn't it mentioned in any of the estate documents? Marcus pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and started down the stairs, leaving Owen at the top with strict instructions not to move. The steps were solid, recently reinforced, leading down 15 feet into what appeared to be a natural cavern in the limestone. The quarry had been built into a hillside, and Marcus had always known there were caves in these hills, networks of passages carved by ancient water, but Raymond had never mentioned any beneath the property. The cavern opened into a space roughly the size of a 2-car garage, its walls natural stone, its floor leveled with concrete. And it was full. Not with old equipment or forgotten files, but with carefully organized shelves holding dozens of wooden crates, each labeled with dates going back 40 years. Work lights hung from the ceiling, connected to a generator in the corner, still humming with power. Marcus approached the nearest crate, dated 3 months before Raymond's death. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were stones. Not limestone from the quarry, but something else entirely, smooth and dark with veins of deep blue running through them, almost like marble but with a luster that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. He lifted one, surprised by its weight, and held it under his phone's light. The blue veins seemed to pulse, an optical illusion probably, but unsettling. The stone was cool to the touch, almost cold, and perfectly smooth, as if it had been polished for hours. The other crates held more of the same, hundreds of stones in various sizes, all sharing that strange dark surface and those luminous blue veins. Some were marked with tags, specimens, deposits, extraction dates, coordinates. At the back of the cavern, a work table held notebooks, their pages filled with Raymond's precise handwriting, sketches and measurements and observations that meant nothing to Marcus at first glance. He opened the most recent notebook, dated 2 weeks before Raymond's death. Final extraction complete, the entry read. 43 years of careful removal, and I've barely scratched the surface of the vein. Thomas was right. This deposit is unlike anything in documented geology. The luminescence properties alone would revolutionize industrial applications, and the hardness tests continue to defy standard metrics. But I cannot bring this forward. Cannot trust what they would do with it, how they would exploit it. Better it stays hidden until someone with Bennett blood comes back to claim it. Someone who might understand what it means to protect something precious from those who only see profit. Marcus read the passage 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications. His grandfather had been mining something secret for 43 years, something valuable enough to hide, something he believed was worth protecting even at the cost of keeping silent, of pushing away the only family he had left. "Daddy?" Owen's voice called from the top of the stairs, thin with worry. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, buddy. Just checking things out." Marcus's voice sounded strange in the cavern, swallowed by the stone. He carefully replaced the specimen, closed the crate, and tucked the notebook under his arm. Whatever this was, whatever Raymond had been protecting, it had just become Marcus's burden to carry. He climbed back up the stairs, locked the door behind him, and looked at his son waiting in the dying afternoon light. Owen's shoes had holes in them. Their rent was due in a week. The meatpacking plant was threatening layoffs. And beneath this broken-down quarry, beneath the debt and decay, Raymond had hidden something that might be worth more than Marcus could comprehend. "Did you find treasure?" Owen asked. Marcus looked at the locked door, at the rusted equipment, at the limestone walls of the quarry rising against the darkening sky. He thought about 15 years of foster homes, of Raymond's silence, of the way love sometimes wore the face of abandonment when you were too young to understand protection from protection. "Maybe," he said finally. "But we need to be very careful who we tell." As they walked back toward the car, Marcus saw what he'd missed on the way in, fresh tire tracks in the mud near the processing shed, at least 3 different vehicles, none of them small. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't been invited. The quarry suddenly felt less like a forgotten ruin and more like something being watched. Marcus pulled Owen closer, quickening their pace, and made a decision that would change everything. He would come back tomorrow, alone, and figure out exactly what Raymond had died protecting. Behind them, as the last light faded from the sky, the quarry stood silent, keeping its secrets the way it had for 43 years, waiting for the moment when those secrets would finally claw their way into the light. Marcus called in sick to the plant for the first time in 2 years, left Owen with Mrs. Kowalski next door who watched him sometimes for $20 and a promise of groceries, and drove back to the quarry before sunrise. The October morning was cold enough to fog his breath, and the access road seemed longer in the pre-dawn darkness, every pothole and washout jarring his truck's worn suspension. He'd barely slept, Raymond's notebook spread across his kitchen table until 3 in the morning, trying to decode his grandfather's careful observations about extraction techniques, density measurements, and something Raymond called the resonance problem. The tire tracks were still there when he arrived, clearer now in the angled light. 3 vehicles at least, one of them heavy enough to leave deep ruts near the processing shed. Marcus parked behind the house where his truck wouldn't be visible from the road and approached the equipment shed on foot, carrying a better flashlight and a crowbar he'd borrowed from his neighbor's garage. The padlock on the cavern door hung open, freshly cut, the hasp bent where someone had pried it apart with force. Marcus's stomach dropped. He'd locked it himself yesterday, tested it twice before leaving. Someone had come back during the night. He descended the stairs slowly, crowbar ready, but the cavern was empty of people. Not empty of damage though. 2 crates had been opened, their contents scattered across the concrete floor, stones rolled into corners, the careful organization Raymond had maintained for decades destroyed in what looked like a frantic search. The notebooks were gone from the work table, all of them, leaving only the imprints in the dust where they'd sat. Marcus knelt among the scattered stones, his hands shaking with something that felt like grief and fury mixed together. Someone knew. Someone had been watching the property, waiting for Raymond to die, and now they'd taken 43 years of research and left Marcus with nothing but questions and broken locks. He was still kneeling there when he heard footsteps on the stairs. The man who descended was in his 60s, wearing work clothes that had seen better days and boots caked in limestone dust. His face was weathered in the way that spoke of decades outdoors, and his eyes held a wariness that Marcus recognized from his own mirror. The man stopped 3 steps from the bottom, taking in Marcus's defensive posture with the crowbar, and raised both hands slowly. "Easy there, son. I'm not here to cause trouble." "Then why'd you break my lock?" Marcus stood, keeping the crowbar visible. "That wasn't me. I got here about 20 minutes ago, found it same as you." The man descended the final steps, moving carefully. "Name's Thomas Bridger. I worked this quarry with your grandfather for near about 30 years. The name hit Marcus like a fist. Thomas was right, Raymond had written in the notebook. "This deposit is unlike anything in documented geology." "You're the one who found it first," Marcus said. "The stones. Raymond wrote about you." Thomas's expression shifted, surprise mixing with something that might have been relief. "He kept the notebooks then." "Good. I was afraid they'd been destroyed when he died." He looked around the ransacked cavern, his jaw tightening. "Seems someone else knew about them too." "Who?" "Could be a few people. The bank sent assessors after Raymond passed, more thorough than they needed to be for a standard property evaluation. Then there's Jack Henley, owns the aggregate company over in Millerton, been trying to buy this land for 15 years. And," Thomas hesitated, "there's your uncle." Marcus felt the words like cold water. "I don't have an uncle. Raymond's brother, Nathan. Moved to California in the 70s, but he's been back in the area about 6 months now. Showed up at the quarry twice before Raymond died, wanting to talk about family legacy and shared inheritance. Raymond sent him away both times, told me Nathan didn't have any claim to what we'd built here." The information came too fast, reshaping Marcus's understanding of the situation. Raymond had a brother. Had kept that secret the same way he'd kept everything else, locked behind silence and careful distance. Marcus set down the crowbar, suddenly exhausted by the weight of discoveries that kept unfolding like boxes within boxes. Why didn't Raymond ever tell me about any of this? The stones, the mining, any of it? Thomas moved to the work table, running his hand over the empty surface where the notebooks had been. "Protection, I suspect." Raymond believed silence was the best shield. He watched his own father nearly lose everything when word got out about a quartz deposit on the property back in the 40s. Prospectors, lawyers, people with money and no conscience, they descended like locusts. His father died fighting them in court, broken bitter. Raymond swore he'd never let that happen again. So he just, mined in secret for 40 years and told no one? He told me, but only because I'm the one who uncovered the first stones back in 1981. We were blasting a new section, deeper than we'd gone before, and the explosion opened up a scene we didn't expect. Thomas picked up one of the scattered stones, turning it over in his calloused hands. "These aren't limestone, Marcus. Hell, they're not like anything else on Earth. We sent samples to 3 different geology labs under fake names, paid cash, got the same answer every time: unknown composition, properties inconsistent with known minerals, and structure that suggested formation under impossible conditions." "What do you mean, impossible?" "The crystalline matrix requires pressures and temperatures that don't exist in Earth's crust, not at this depth. One lab suggested extraterrestrial origin, like a meteorite impact deposit, except there's no evidence of any impact event in this region. Another thought we'd somehow created synthetic stones and were testing them. The third lab refused to release their findings and tried to trace where we'd sent the samples from. Thomas set the stone down carefully. That's when Raymond decided we had to go underground with the operation. Keep extracting, document everything, but tell nobody. He believed someday the world would be ready for this knowledge, but not yet. Not while men with money could take it all away. Marcus looked at the scattered stones, at the empty crates, at the violated sanctuary his grandfather had protected for decades. Looks like he was right to worry. The question is, who took the notebooks? And what do they plan to do with them? Thomas moved toward a section of wall that Marcus hadn't examined closely. There's something else you need to see. Raymond installed it about 5 years ago, said it was insurance. Behind a loose panel, Thomas revealed a small digital camera, its lens pointed at the cavern entrance, connected to what appeared to be a battery backup system. Motion activated. Uploads to a cloud server Raymond set up. If someone came through here last night, we've got them on video. They climbed back up to the shed where Thomas pulled out a laptop from his truck, ancient and slow but functional. It took 20 minutes to access the cloud server with credentials Thomas had written in a small notebook he carried. When the video files finally loaded, they showed exactly what Marcus had feared. 3 men had entered the cavern at 2:47 a.m. The first was in his late 50s, expensive outdoor gear that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty cavern, moving with the entitled confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. The second was younger, maybe 30, built like he worked security or enforcement, scanning the space with professional thoroughness. The third man made Marcus's breath catch. He looked like Raymond, or rather like what Raymond might have looked like 20 years ago. Same broad shoulders, same way of standing with weight slightly forward, same precise movements as he directed the other 2 men towards specific crates. That's Nathan, Thomas confirmed quietly. Your uncle. And the man in the expensive jacket is Jack Henley, the aggregate company owner I mentioned. Don't know the third man. They watched in silence as the 3 men systematically opened crates, examined stones, and ultimately loaded the notebooks into a canvas bag. The audio was poor, but Marcus caught fragments of conversation. 40 years of extraction data, geological survey would trigger federal claims, worth millions if we control the narrative. The kid doesn't know anything, Raymond made sure of that. The video ended with the men leaving, Nathan pausing at the entrance to look back at the cavern with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Satisfaction maybe, or regret, or the complicated emotion that came with stealing from a dead brother. They're planning something, Marcus said. Something that needs those notebooks. Thomas nodded grimly. Probably filing their own claim to the mineral rights, using Raymond's research to prove the deposit exists and its value. If they can argue Raymond abandoned proper extraction protocols or that the stones constitute a significant mineral discovery requiring federal oversight, they might be able to trigger an eminent domain situation or force a partition sale. Either way, you'd lose the property. Can they do that? With the right lawyers and the right evidence? Yes. Especially if they can show you don't have the means to continue operations or pay off the existing debt. The bank would side with whoever's offering to buy them out. Thomas closed the laptop. How much time do you have before foreclosure? 6 months. Less now, probably 5.5. And how much is the debt? $73,000. Thomas let out a low whistle. That's steep for a property this size. Raymond never carried that kind of debt before. Something about the timing bothered Marcus, a pattern he couldn't quite see. When did Raymond take out the loan? I don't know that he did. Last I knew, the property was clear. He'd paid it off completely in 2019, told me he wanted to make sure it was unencumbered when Thomas stopped, understanding dawning in his eyes. When you came back. He knew you'd come back eventually. The implications settled over Marcus like weight. Raymond had been preparing for this, had cleared the debt and then somehow accrued it again in the final years of his life. But why? What had he needed $73,000 for? The generator, Marcus said suddenly, remembering the humming equipment in the cavern. The shelving, the organization, the camera system. He was preparing the cavern, making it secure. All that equipment costs money. And he was sick, Thomas added quietly. Last year of his life, he was spending a lot of time at doctors, specialists over in the city. Never told me what for, but I could see him getting weaker. He knew he was running out of time. Marcus stood and walked to the shed's entrance, looking out at the quarry, at the deep cut in the earth that 4 generations of Bennett men had worked. The October sun was higher now, illuminating the limestone walls in shades of cream and rust, and Marcus could suddenly see what he hadn't before: the quarry wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a trust, a secret kept through decades of silence, protected by a man who'd understood that some things were too valuable to share with a world that only measured worth in immediate profit. He pushed me away to protect this, Marcus said, not quite a question. Thomas joined him at the entrance. Raymond had a lot of faults. He wasn't warm, wasn't easy to love, wasn't the grandfather you deserved. But everything he did because he believed in something bigger than comfort or connection. He believed this deposit could change things, could provide something valuable not just to your family but to the world, if it was handled right. When the state took you away, he could have fought. Could have cleaned up the house, shown them he was capable. But he looked at you, 12 years old and already carrying too much, and he made a choice. Let you go where you'd have opportunities, where you'd learn to be more than just a quarry worker, where you'd maybe get educated enough to understand what you'd be inheriting someday. That's a lot of faith in a kid who never came back. You're here now. Thomas turned to face him fully. Raymond bet his whole life on you showing up eventually, ready or not. Now Nathan and his partners are betting you'll fail, that you'll take whatever settlement they offer and walk away. So the question is, which one of them knew you better? Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to say that Raymond hadn't known him at all, that 15 years of silence had made sure of that. But standing here in the shed that smelled like his childhood, looking at equipment Raymond had maintained with obsessive care, Marcus recognized something he'd been avoiding. Raymond had known him well enough to understand he'd need time, need distance, need to fail and build himself back up before he could carry the weight of this inheritance. I can't pay off $73,000 in 5 months, Marcus said. I'm barely keeping rent paid as it is. You don't need to pay it off. You need to prove the property is worth more than the debt, that you have a viable plan for continued operation. The stones, Marcus. That's your leverage. If you can get independent verification of their value, proper geological assessment from someone who can't be bought off, you might be able to secure new financing or partners who'd pay off the debt in exchange for extraction rights. And Nathan? He's got the notebooks, all of Raymond's research. Thomas smiled, thin and sharp. He's got copies. Raymond kept originals of everything in a second location. Old habit from his father's court battles. He didn't trust banks, didn't trust safety deposit boxes. But he trusted stone. Thomas pointed toward the quarry's main pit. There's a sealed chamber in the north wall, about 40 feet down, hidden behind a section that looks like natural limestone. Raymond installed it in the 80s, waterproof and temperature-controlled. That's where he kept the master records. Marcus stared at the quarry, at the sheer walls and the green water pooled at the bottom. You're telling me I need to rappel down 40 feet into a flooded quarry to access my grandfather's files? I'm telling you that if you want to fight for this place, you've got to be willing to do what Raymond did, go deeper than anyone expects, trust the stone to hold your weight, and understand that some treasures only reveal themselves to people desperate enough to risk everything for them. The parallel wasn't subtle, but it landed with the force of truth. Marcus had spent 15 years building a life on safe surfaces, taking jobs that paid enough to survive but required nothing of his heart, raising Owen in a rented duplex because buying property meant commitment and risk. And here was the quarry, the inheritance he'd resented, asking him to do exactly what he'd avoided, descend into the dark, trust what he couldn't see, and bet everything on stone holding firm. I need to think about this, Marcus said, though he already knew his answer. Had known at the moment he found the cavern opened, violated, stolen from. Whatever Raymond had been protecting, Nathan and his partners saw as nothing more than profit. But Marcus had spent too many years being dismissed, being told he wasn't worth fighting for, to let someone else take what his grandfather had built. "Don't think too long," Thomas warned. "Nathan's got a head start and resources you don't. Whatever he's planning, he'll move fast." They spent the next hour securing the cavern as best they could, installing a new lock Thomas had in his truck and documenting the remaining stones with photographs. Thomas knew people, he said, geologists and mineralogists who worked outside the corporate system, people who might be willing to authenticate the stones without triggering the kind of attention that would bring government oversight or legal challenges. It would take time though, and money Marcus didn't have for sample preparation and testing. By noon, Marcus was back in his truck, Thomas's contact information folded in his wallet and a single stone wrapped in cloth sitting on his passenger seat. The stone seemed to pulse with internal light, those blue veins glowing faintly even in daylight, and Marcus found himself glancing at it repeatedly on the drive back to Millerton, as if it might disappear or reveal some secret if he looked at it right. Owen was waiting on Mrs. Kowalski's porch when Marcus pulled up, bouncing with the impatient energy of a 6-year-old who'd been promised they'd go to the park after school. Marcus's phone showed 3 missed calls from the plant supervisor, probably wondering why he hadn't called in properly, and a text from his landlord about a lease renewal he needed to sign. Normal life, pressing in on all sides, demanding attention and compliance. "Did you find more treasure?" Owen asked, climbing into the truck. Marcus looked at his son, at the holes in his shoes and the second-hand jacket that was already too small, and made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. "Yeah, buddy. I found something important. And I think we might need to move." "Move where?" "To the quarry. To Grandpa's house." Owen's eyes widened. "Can I have my own room? With purple walls like I wanted?" Marcus thought of the clapboard house with its rotted porch and boarded windows, of the work it would take to make it livable, of the risk and uncertainty and the very real possibility that he'd lose it all anyway. But he also thought of Raymond, spending 43 years pulling stones from the earth in secret, trusting that someday someone would understand what he'd been protecting. "Yeah," Marcus said, pulling away from the curb. "Yeah, you can have purple walls." That night, after Owen was asleep, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the stone from the cavern and Raymond's notebook, reading by lamplight about extraction techniques and resonance problems and the careful observations of a man who'd devoted his life to understanding something that defied explanation. In the margin of one page, Raymond had written a note that Marcus had missed the first time through, "For Marcus, when he's ready. The land remembers. Make sure he knows." Marcus ran his finger over the words, feeling the indent of the pen, the pressure Raymond had applied to make sure the message was clear. The land remembers. Not just the stones or the quarry or the secret mining, but something larger. Legacy. Blood. The stubborn insistence that some things matter more than money or comfort or the easy path. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Heard you're looking into your grandfather's property. Might want to reconsider. Some discoveries are better left buried. Jack Henley." Already making threats, already assuming Marcus would fold under pressure. Marcus deleted the text and opened his laptop, searching for information on mineral rights law, on how to contest property claims, on the legal definition of abandonment versus preservation. The fight was coming whether he wanted it or not. He worked until 3 in the morning, building a plan that was probably impossible, definitely risky, and the only path forward that didn't end with him signing away everything Raymond had protected. By the time he finally collapsed into bed, the eastern sky was already lightening, and Marcus dreamed of descending into dark water, searching for a sealed chamber in stone walls that seemed to shift and breathe like living things, while voices called from above, claiming ownership of depths they'd never had the courage to explore. The water at the bottom of the quarry was colder than Marcus expected, even through the wetsuit Thomas had lent him from his own diving days. It was late October now, 6 weeks since that first visit, 6 weeks of preparation that had drained what little savings Marcus had and required explanations to Owen about why they were sleeping on air mattresses in a house that still had no heat and only intermittent electricity. Thomas steadied the aluminum boat they'd hauled down the old access ramp, watching as Marcus checked his borrowed equipment one more time. The descent rope was anchored to the derrick above, and the sealed chamber was supposedly 40 feet down the north wall, marked by a series of drill holes Raymond had made in a specific pattern. 3 holes in a triangle, Thomas had said, like a constellation pointing to treasure. "You don't have to do this today," Thomas said, though they both knew that was a lie. The bank had received a formal petition from Nathan Bennett and Jack Henley 3 days ago, claiming the property contained significant mineral deposits that were being mismanaged by an incompetent heir with no geological expertise. They'd submitted doctored versions of Raymond's research, enough to trigger an emergency assessment hearing scheduled for next week. If Marcus couldn't produce the original documentation proving continuous and deliberate extraction, proving Raymond's methods were sound and his intentions clear, the judge might rule in favor of a forced sale to parties with appropriate resources and knowledge. "I've been avoiding deep water my whole life," Marcus said, pulling on the mask. "Might as well stop now." He went over the side before he could reconsider, the cold hitting him like a physical blow even through the wet suit. The water was murky with limestone sediment and algae, visibility maybe 10 feet on a good day. Marcus let himself sink slowly, following the guide rope, his flashlight cutting weak beams through the green darkness. The quarry walls were different underwater, smoother where they'd been carved by equipment, rough where natural stone remained. Fish scattered at his approach, small things that had no business being this far from any creek or river but had found their way here anyway, adapting to live in this man-made canyon filled with rainwater and runoff. 20 feet down, 30, the pressure building in his ears. Marcus equalized and kept descending, searching the north wall for the pattern Thomas had described. The stone here was darker, older strata exposed by decades of cutting, and Marcus ran his gloved hand along the surface, feeling for the drill holes that would mark Raymond's hidden chamber. At 38 feet, he found them. 3 holes arranged in a triangle, each about an inch wide, weathered but unmistakable. Marcus traced the pattern with his flashlight, then began feeling around the marked section, searching for the mechanism Thomas had said would be there. Raymond had engineered it himself, a pressure plate hidden in what looked like a natural fissure, waterproof and weighted to resist accidental triggering. It took Marcus 5 minutes to find it, his fingers going numb despite the gloves, and another 3 to apply the right combination of pressure and rotation. Something clicked deep in the stone, and a section of wall the size of a small door shifted inward, revealing a sealed chamber beyond. The space was small, maybe 4 feet in each direction, and completely dry thanks to the rubber gaskets Raymond had installed around the entrance. Inside, protected by layers of waterproof cases, were Raymond's original notebooks, going back to 1981, along with sample stones, geological surveys, and something Marcus hadn't expected, letters. Dozens of them, addressed to Marcus at various foster homes over the years, each one returned unopened with refused or moved, no forwarding address stamped across the envelopes. Marcus's hands shook as he loaded everything into the waterproof bag he'd brought, his air supply gauge showing he'd been down longer than planned. The letters would have to wait. Right now, he needed to surface before hypothermia or nitrogen narcosis made decisions for him. The ascent felt longer than the descent, his body heavy and his thoughts tangled with the image of those returned letters, evidence of attempts Raymond had made that Marcus had never known about. The foster system had a way of losing things, mail included, but seeing the stack of envelopes addressed in Raymond's careful handwriting changed something fundamental in Marcus's understanding of the past 15 years. Thomas pulled him into the boat, helped him strip off the mask and tank, wrapped him in blankets while Marcus's teeth chattered too hard for speech. The waterproof bag sat between them, 43 years of secrets and attempted connections sealed in plastic and hope. "You got it?" Thomas asked. Marcus nodded, unable to articulate the complexity of what he'd actually found. They hauled the boat back up the ramp and carried the bag to the house where Owen was supposed to be doing homework but was actually building an elaborate fort from moving boxes in what would eventually be his bedroom. The boy looked up as they entered, taking in his father's wet hair and shaking hands with the calm acceptance he'd developed over the past weeks of chaos. "Did you find Grandpa's treasure?" "Yeah, buddy. I found it." That night, After Owen was asleep in his 4 of boxes, Marcus sat at the kitchen table that had once been Raymond's and opened the first letter. The postmark was dated 3 months after Marcus had entered foster care, sent to the first home they'd placed him in with the Hendersons, who'd kept him for 6 weeks before deciding he was too angry for their household. The letter was short, Raymond's handwriting smaller than in his notebooks, as if he'd been trying to fit as much as possible on a single page. Marcus, I know you're angry. You have the right. I should have fought them when they came. Should have told them I could do better, clean up the house, make it proper. But I looked at you that day, 12 years old and already carrying your mother's sadness and your father's rage, and I thought about what this place would make you. Another quarry worker with stone dust in his lungs and limited horizons. You're smarter than that. Deserve more than that. The caseworker says the Hendersons are good people, that they'll make sure you finish school, maybe even help with college. That's a future I can't give you, not here, not with the work that needs doing and the secrets that need keeping. I'm not asking you to understand. Just know that letting you go was the hardest thing I've done, harder than anything the stone ever demanded. And if you hate me for it, that's fair. But someday, when you're ready, come back. The land will still be here. And so will I, if I'm lucky. Raymond Marcus read it 3 times, then opened the next letter, and the next. They spanned 15 years, sent to every address the foster system had provided, tracking Marcus's movement through homes and schools and the various attempts at permanency that never quite stuck. Some letters were practical, updates about the quarry or weather or equipment. Others were more personal, Raymond's awkward attempts to share pieces of himself he'd never managed in person. One letter, written when Marcus was 16 and living with a family in the city, contained a confession: your grandmother, Iris, died when your mother was 8. Cancer, fast and cruel, the kind that takes everything before you understand what you're losing. I failed them both after that, couldn't figure out how to be soft when the world felt so hard. Your mother left as soon as she could, and I don't blame her. She wanted a life that felt like living, not just surviving. But she never learned how to do that either, and I carry that failure like ballast. When you came to live here after she passed, I saw my chance to do better, to be what I wasn't for her. But I was already too much stone and not enough warmth, and the caseworker saw that before I could change it. Maybe she was right. Maybe you're better off learning how to be human from people who remember how. The documents in the waterproof cases were comprehensive: extraction logs showing careful, sustainable mining over 43 years, geological surveys from multiple independent labs, chemical analyses proving the stones were unlike any known terrestrial mineral. Raymond had documented everything with scientific precision, building a case for responsible stewardship that directly contradicted Nathan's claim of abandonment and mismanagement. There was also a will, newer than the one filed with the court, dated just weeks before Raymond's death. It specified that the property and all mineral rights were to pass to Marcus unconditionally, with a trust established from sale of extracted stones to cover property taxes and basic maintenance for 15 years. The debt the bank claimed wasn't debt at all, but rather money Raymond had moved into a separate account, designated for Marcus's use in fighting any legal challenges to the inheritance. Thomas arrived at dawn to find Marcus still at the table, surrounded by papers and letters, the stone from the caverns sitting like a paperweight on top of Raymond's final will. You didn't sleep. Couldn't. Marcus gestured at the accumulated evidence. He was trying, Thomas. All those years, he was trying. I know. He talked about you constantly near the end. Worried you wouldn't come back, worried you'd come back and not understand, worried he'd die before he could explain. Thomas sat down heavily. Raymond wasn't built for words. He put everything into the stone, into protecting this place for you. That was his language of love, even if it looked like abandonment. Marcus picked up the newest will. He left money. $73,000 in a trust account, meant to pay off the debt and cover legal fees. The bank's been sitting on it, waiting to see if I'd fold. Will you? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with everything the past 6 weeks had cost. Marcus had quit his job at the plant, pulled Owen from his school, moved them into a house that was barely habitable, and spent every moment since learning about stone extraction, mineral rights law, and how to be the kind of person who didn't run when inheritance demanded he stay and fight. "No," Marcus said finally. "Nathan can present his doctored research at the hearing. I'll present Raymond's originals. Let the judge decide who understood my grandfather's work better." The hearing took place in a county courthouse that smelled like floor polish and old wood, before a judge who looked tired of property disputes and family feuds. Nathan sat with Jack Henley and their lawyer, expensive suits and confident postures that said they'd already won. Nathan looked up as Marcus entered with Thomas and their court-appointed attorney, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition maybe, or the uncomfortable awareness that Marcus looked exactly like Raymond had at 33, same build and same stubborn set to his jaw. The proceedings were technical, both sides presenting geological surveys and extraction documentation, arguing over mineral rights and proper management. Nathan's lawyer painted Marcus as an absentee heir with no expertise, someone who'd abandoned the property for 15 years and only return when there was profit to be had. Marcus's attorney, a young woman named Sarah Chen who worked for a rural legal aid organization, countered with Raymond's detailed records showing continuous, careful extraction and clear intention to pass the operation to his grandson. When the judge asked Marcus directly why he should be trusted with property he'd ignored for over a decade, Marcus stood and spoke truth he'd only recently learned how to voice. "Your Honor, I didn't ignore this property. I didn't know it existed as anything other than the place I was taken from when I was 12. My grandfather, Raymond Bennett, made a choice when Child Services removed me. He let me go because he believed I deserved opportunities he couldn't provide. And for 15 years, he sent letters I never received, tracking my life from a distance, waiting for me to be ready to come back." Marcus pulled out the stack of returned letters, placed them on the table. "I'm not an expert in geology or mining. But I'm an expert in what it means to be thrown away by the system and told you don't matter. Raymond protected this land because he understood that some things are worth more than immediate profit. He protected it for me, even when I didn't know it, even when it would have been easier to sell it all and live comfortably. My uncle, Nathan Bennett, who's claiming he has better understanding of Raymond's work, abandoned his brother in the 1970s and only came back when he thought there was money to be made." Nathan's lawyer objected, but the judge waved him silent, eyes on Marcus. "I'm asking for a chance to prove I can steward this land the way Raymond did. Not for profit, not for exploitation, but for the possibility that some discoveries need protection until the world is ready for them. Give me a year. If I can't maintain the property and continue responsible extraction, then let the court revisit the question. But don't take it away now, when I've finally come home." The judge ruled from the bench, unusual but apparently decisive. Marcus had 1 year to demonstrate viable operation of the quarry and payment of all outstanding property obligations. The trust account Raymond had established would be released to him immediately to cover the debt. Nathan and Jack Henley's petition was denied, with a warning that any further harassment would result in sanctions. Walking out of the courthouse, Marcus felt Owen slip his hand into his, small and trusting. Nathan stood by his car across the street, watching them with an expression Marcus couldn't read. After a moment, Nathan crossed the street, stopping a careful distance away. "He talked about you," Nathan said quietly. "Raymond. When I came back, tried to reconnect, he barely spoke to me. But he talked about you constantly. Marcus this, Marcus that, wondering if you'd finished school, if you were happy, if you'd ever forgive him. You tried to take it from me," Marcus said flatly. "I tried to take what I thought I deserved. I'm the brother who stayed in touch, who called on birthdays, who tried to maintain family. And Raymond left everything to a grandson he barely knew." Nathan's voice carried bitterness and something that might have been grief. "But standing there in that courtroom, listening to you talk about letters you never got, I realized Raymond knew you better than either of us understood. He knew you'd need time, need distance, need to fail before you could build. I never learned that lesson. Never learned how to be anything but entitled. What do you want, Nathan?" "Nothing. Just wanted to say Raymond chose right. I hope you prove worthy of it." Nathan walked back to his car without waiting for a response, leaving Marcus standing on the courthouse steps with his son and a year to prove he could protect what Raymond had spent a lifetime building. The quarry became livable slowly, one repair at a time, funded by careful sale of extracted stones to the mineralogists Thomas connected them with. The prices were extraordinary, enough that Marcus could afford to hire contractors for the major repairs while he learned the daily work of running a quarry operation. Owen thrived, exploring the property with the fearlessness of childhood, making friends with the neighbor kids who came to see the magic stones Marcus's son claimed could glow in the dark. Thomas stayed on as a partner, teaching Marcus everything Raymond had taught him about extraction techniques, about reading the stone, about working the land with respect rather than exploitation. They established protocols for sustainable mining, extracting only what they needed, documenting everything with the same precision Raymond had maintained. The letters became a ritual. Each night after Owen was asleep, Marcus would read one more from the stack, tracking his grandfather's attempts at connection across 15 years of silence. Some nights the words felt like comfort, other nights like accusation. But gradually, Marcus began to understand that Raymond's choice hadn't been abandonment but a different kind of love, the kind that lets go rather than holds too tight, that trusts an eventual return rather than demanding immediate presence. Winter came hard to the quarry, snow covering the limestone walls and freezing the water at the bottom of the main pit. Marcus and Owen strung lights around the house, transforming the clapboard structure into something that looked almost welcoming against the stark landscape. They celebrated Owen's 7th birthday with a small party, Thomas and Mrs. Kowalski and a few kids from school playing in the snow and eating cake in a kitchen that finally had reliable heat. On the anniversary of Marcus's return to the property, he stood at the edge of the main pit, watching the sun rise over the limestone walls, illuminating the striations that told the story of geological time compressed into stone. Owen joined him, wrapped in a coat too big but growing into it the way children do. "Do you think Grandpa Raymond would be happy we're here?" Owen asked. Marcus thought about the question, about the letters in the hidden chamber and the 43 years of careful protection. About the choice Raymond had made to let him go and the trust that someday Marcus would find his way back. About the way love sometimes looks like distance, and how a legacy is built not in moments but in the patient accumulation of days lived with purpose. "Yeah, buddy. I think he'd be happy." The land stretched out before them, 15 acres of stone and soil and secrets still waiting to be discovered. The quarry had taken everything from Marcus once, had been the site of his greatest loss and deepest wound. But standing here now, with his son beside him and work waiting in a future that felt less like survival and more like building, Marcus understood what Raymond had known all along: some places demand everything you have to give, but if you're willing to stay and fight and trust the stone to hold your weight, they give you something back that can't be measured in money or comfort or easy peace. They give you roots. They give you purpose. They give you home. The sun cleared the eastern wall of the quarry, flooding the pit with golden light, and Marcus saw what he'd missed on every previous visit, the way the limestone seemed to glow from within, holding warmth against the winter cold, remembering the ancient sea that had laid it down grain by grain, millions of years of pressure and time and transformation written into every layer. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Chen, their lawyer, confirming that the property was now fully transferred, all debts settled, the title clear and uncontested. Marcus Bennett, legal owner of Bennett Quarry, inheritor of stones that defied explanation and a legacy built on silence and trust. Owen tugged his hand. "Can we go check the garden plot? I want to mark where we'll plant in spring." Marcus looked down at his son, at the boy who'd adapted to upheaval with grace, who'd accepted this strange life without complaint, who'd somehow understood that coming here was important in ways that transcended comfort or convenience. "Yeah, let's go." They walked together toward the south field where Thomas had suggested they establish a proper garden, the ground frozen now but rich with potential come thaw. Marcus thought about Raymond working this land for decades, about the stones pulled from deep earth, about the letters sent to addresses where no one waited to receive them. About how trust sometimes meant waiting years for promises to find their way home. The quarry stood solid behind them, patient as stone, holding its secrets and its gifts, waiting for spring when the real work would begin. And Marcus understood, finally, that he wasn't here to complete Raymond's work or to fulfill some predetermined destiny. He was here to continue it, to add his own chapter to a story that had been written in stone and silence, in letters never delivered and love never spoken but always, always present. The land remembered. And now, so would he. Spring came late that year, the ground holding frost until mid-April before finally surrendering to the patient advance of warmth. Marcus stood in what would become their garden, turning soil with a spade that had belonged to Raymond, its wooden handle worn smooth by decades of the same motion he was making now. The earth broke apart in dark clumps, rich and alive with the smell of thaw, and Owen followed behind him, dropping seeds into the furrows with the careful concentration of a child learning ritual. 3 inches apart, Owen reminded himself, measuring the distance with his small hand the way Marcus had taught him. Carrots need room to grow down. Marcus watched his son work, noting how the boy had changed in the 18 months since they'd arrived. Owen was taller now, his hands beginning to show the first calluses from helping with quarry work, his vocabulary expanding to include words like extraction and stratification and sustainability. But more than physical growth, there was a settledness to Owen that hadn't existed in the duplex, a confidence that came from knowing his place in the world wasn't temporary. Thomas emerged from the equipment shed, wiping his hands on a rag darkened with grease. They'd spent the morning servicing the Caterpillar, preparing it for the season's work. The old machine ran smoother now than it had in years, given proper maintenance and the kind of attention Raymond would have approved of. "Stone's looking good in the new section," Thomas said, joining them at the garden's edge. "Colors consistent, veining strong. Should get a decent yield this season without overtaxing the deposit." Marcus nodded, understanding now what he hadn't a year ago, that extraction wasn't just about removing stone from earth, but about reading what the land offered, taking only what could be taken without harm, leaving enough for future harvests. Raymond had known this instinctively, had built his entire operation around the principle that good stewardship meant thinking in generations, not quarters. The stones continued to baffle the scientists who studied them. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a geologist from the State University, had been coming to the quarry monthly since Marcus had reached out through Sarah Chen's legal contacts. Elena was careful, discreet, understood that some discoveries needed protection from the kind of attention that would bring corporate interests and government oversight. Her preliminary findings suggested the stones might be linked to an ancient meteor impact, their unique properties resulting from formation under conditions that briefly existed nowhere else on Earth. Or, she'd said during her last visit, "We're looking at something that will require us to rewrite significant portions of geological science. The crystalline structure doesn't match any known formation process. It's almost as if the stone is still growing, still organizing itself at the molecular level." Marcus had asked her to keep that particular observation quiet, remembering Raymond's caution about discoveries that would attract the wrong kind of interest. Elena had understood, had even seemed relieved. Some knowledge, she'd agreed, needed time to mature before being released into the world. By summer, the garden was producing vegetables that exceeded all reasonable expectations. The tomatoes grew heavy on their vines, the squash sprawled across half the plot, and the carrots Owen had planted so carefully pulled from the ground thick as a man's forearm. Marcus gave away half their harvest to neighbors, to the food bank in town, to anyone who'd accept produce that seemed touched by something beyond ordinary agriculture. "It's the soil," he explained when people asked, which was the truth if not the complete truth. "My grandfather spent decades enriching it." What he didn't mention was how the stones affected everything they touched, how soil mixed with limestone dust from the quarry seemed to accelerate growth and intensify flavor, how plants near the processing shed developed colors slightly brighter than they should be. The land was changed, fundamentally altered by decades of proximity to something that defied explanation, and Marcus was learning to work with that strangeness rather than against it. Owen turned 8 in July, celebrated with a party that filled the house with children's laughter for the first time in probably 50 years. The boy had friends now, real ones, kids from school who came out to the quarry on weekends to explore and build forts and marvel at the deep pit of water that shimmered green in the summer heat. Marcus watched them play and thought about his own childhood here, the loneliness of it, how Raymond's silence had created a space where connection became impossible. But that was changing too. Marcus found himself part of the community in ways he'd never been before, joining the volunteer fire department, attending town council meetings about rural development, becoming someone people knew by name rather than as the Bennett boy who went into foster care. The quarry had a reputation now, not as a place of tragedy or secrets, but as a working operation run with integrity, a business that honored its history while building toward a sustainable future. Nathan called in August, the first contact since the courthouse steps. His voice on the phone was careful, tentative, asking if he could visit, if Marcus would be willing to talk without lawyers present. Marcus agreed, more from curiosity than forgiveness, and Nathan arrived on a Saturday afternoon driving a modest sedan rather than the expensive SUV he'd had before. They sat on the porch, drinking iced tea while Owen played in the yard, and Nathan spoke about things Marcus hadn't expected, about Raymond's childhood, about their father who'd died fighting to keep the quarry, about how Nathan had left because he couldn't stand the weight of inheritance and expectation. About how he'd returned thinking he could claim what he'd abandoned, only to discover that inheritance isn't about blood but about commitment. "I spent 40 years running from this place," Nathan said, looking out at the quarry. "Built a life in California, made good money, convinced myself I'd escaped. But when Raymond died and I came back, I realized I hadn't escaped anything. Just postponed dealing with what it means to be a Bennett, to have this land in your blood whether you want it there or not." "Why'd you try to take it then?" Marcus asked. "If you understood all that, why come after the property?" Nathan was quiet for a long time, ice melting in his glass. "Because I thought if I couldn't have it, at least I could profit from it. Stupid pride. Thinking that if Raymond had chosen you over me, I'd prove you weren't worthy of the choice." He set down his glass. "I was wrong. About you, about what Raymond was protecting, about everything. And I'm sorry." Marcus didn't know if he could forgive, didn't know if forgiveness was even what Nathan needed or deserved. But sitting there on the porch Raymond had built, looking at land Raymond had protected, Marcus understood something about legacy that he hadn't before. It wasn't a prize to be won or lost, wasn't something that could be stolen or given away. Legacy was what you did with what you were given, the choices you made when inheritance demanded you become more than you thought you could be. "I'm not going to say it's okay," Marcus said finally. "What you did caused real harm, made an already difficult situation worse. But I understand why you did it. And I think Raymond would have understood too." Nathan nodded, seeming to accept that conditional peace was better than continued hostility. He stayed for dinner, shared stories about Raymond that Marcus had never heard, left as the sun was setting with a promise to stay in touch. Whether he would or not didn't matter as much as the fact that the conversation had happened, that some wounds could be acknowledged even if they couldn't be fully healed. Autumn brought the first real test of Marcus's stewardship. A developer from the city made an offer to buy the property, $700,000, enough to secure Owen's education and Marcus's future without another day of hard labor. The offer came with assurances that the quarry would be preserved, turned into some kind of heritage site, but Marcus had seen enough corporate promises to know how easily preservation became exploitation. He walked the property boundary on a cold October morning, following the fence line Raymond had maintained for 40 years, and tried to imagine this land belonging to someone else. Tried to picture the quarry filled in or paved over, the house torn down and replaced with something modern and sterile, the garden plowed under for parking lots and visitor centers. But more than that, he tried to imagine Owen growing up somewhere else, tried to picture his son without dirt under his fingernails and the confident stride that came from knowing every inch of 15 acres. Tried to imagine himself back in a duplex somewhere, working shifts at a plant, living a life that felt like survival rather than purpose. Thomas found him by the north boundary, where the woods pressed close and deer trails crossed the property line. "Heard about the offer," Thomas said. "News travels." "It does. So what are you thinking?" Marcus kicked at a fence post, testing its stability. "I'm thinking about what Raymond wrote in one of his letters. About how the easy path is usually the wrong one, at least when it comes to things that matter. I'm thinking about Owen, about what I'd be teaching him if I took the money and walked away." "You'd be teaching him that $700,000 is a lot of money," Thomas said pragmatically. "Which it is. And I'd be teaching him that some things can be bought and sold. That commitment is conditional on convenience. That when the offer gets high enough, you let go of what you claim to value. Marcus turned to face Thomas. Raymond could have sold this place 100 times over. Could have lived comfortably instead of barely scraping by. But he held on because he believed in something bigger than comfort. I might not understand everything he was protecting, might not agree with all his methods, but I understand that principle now. Thomas smiled, the expression carrying satisfaction and maybe relief. Then I guess we're not selling. No. We're not selling. The rejection of the developer's offer rippled through the community, earning Marcus respect from some and accusations of foolishness from others. But the decision settled something in Marcus, clarified his relationship with the land from obligation to ownership in the deepest sense. This wasn't just property he'd inherited. It was responsibility he'd accepted, legacy he'd chosen to continue. Winter came again, marking 2 full years since Marcus's return. The house was winterized now, properly insulated and heated, the porch rebuilt and the roof replaced. Owen had his purple bedroom, though he'd added posters and drawings that made it distinctly his own space rather than just painted walls. The quarry sat dormant under snow, waiting for spring, and Marcus used the quiet months to plan expansion carefully, to study Elena's geological reports, to build relationships with ethical buyers who valued sustainable extraction. On the anniversary of Raymond's death, Marcus and Owen hiked to the sealed chamber in the quarry wall, now accessible by a proper platform and ladder system Thomas had helped install. They'd turned it into a kind of memorial, leaving the space as Raymond had arranged it but adding photos and items that honored his memory. Owen placed a drawing he'd made, showing the quarry with figures that might have been Raymond and Marcus working side by side across generations. "Did Grandpa Raymond know I'd be born?" Owen asked, arranging his drawing carefully among the other items. Marcus considered the question. Raymond had died before Owen's birth, had never known his great-grandson would exist. But looking at the care Raymond had put into preserving this place, the decades of patient work and planning, Marcus thought maybe Raymond had known in the way that mattered. "I think he knew someone would come," Marcus said. "Maybe not specifically you, but someone who'd need what this place offers. Someone who'd understand that some legacies are worth protecting even when they're hard." They climbed back up as snow began to fall, soft flakes that landed on the limestone and melted, temporary touches on stone that had witnessed centuries. The quarry would outlast them all, Marcus knew, would be here long after he and Owen were gone, bearing whatever meaning future generations gave it. Thomas retired in the spring, officially at least, though he still came around most days to advise and assist and maintain the routines that had defined his adult life. They held a small ceremony, marking 45 years of work at the quarry, and Thomas spoke briefly about Raymond, about loyalty and friendship and the privilege of working stone. "Some people build with stone," Thomas said. "Raymond and I, we spent our lives helping stone reveal what it already was. That's a different kind of work, requires a different kind of respect. Marcus understands that now. And someday, Owen will too." By summer of the 3rd year, the quarry was profitable in modest but sustainable ways. Marcus had established contracts with specialty builders and artists who valued the unique properties of the stone, people who paid premium prices for material that couldn't be sourced anywhere else. The money wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, enough to maintain the property and save for Owen's future and occasionally help neighbors who were struggling. Elena published a paper about the stones, carefully anonymizing the source location, presenting them as a geological curiosity that raised interesting questions about formation processes. The paper generated interest in academic circles but, as Elena had hoped, didn't trigger the kind of commercial attention Raymond had feared. Marcus read it and thought about secrets kept and knowledge shared, about finding the balance between protection and progress. Owen turned 10, and Marcus began teaching him the work properly, not just helping around the edges but understanding extraction, learning to read stone, developing the Bennett hands Raymond had once spoken of. The boy took to it naturally, seemed to have an instinctive understanding of where to place charges, how to section material, when to push and when to let stone rest. "He's got Raymond's gift," Thomas observed, watching Owen examine a newly exposed section of the deposit. "Rare thing, that connection to stone. Some people work it their whole lives and never develop it." Owens had it from the start. Marcus watched his son and understood that this was what Raymond had protected, what all the silence and sacrifice had been for, the possibility that someone with Bennett blood would find their way back to this land and recognize it as home. Not just territory or property, but the place where their particular skills and sensibilities could take root and flourish. The seasons turned, marking time and harvests and snowfall and the gradual weathering of stone. Marcus found Raymond's presence everywhere, not as haunting but as guidance, the careful systems and preparations that continued to reveal themselves. A tool cache buried near the north fence. A journal hidden in the attic detailing every significant weather event for 30 years. Seeds saved from the garden's most productive years, stored in a temperature-controlled container Marcus found behind a false wall in the cellar. Each discovery felt like a conversation with a man who'd understood that love sometimes meant preparing people for your absence, leaving behind everything they'd need to succeed without you. Nathan visited occasionally, awkward visits that gradually became easier as he and Marcus found common ground and shared history. Nathan never asked to be involved in the quarry's operation, seemed content to witness from a distance, to occasionally tell Owen stories about Raymond that Marcus had never known. The reconciliation wasn't complete, perhaps never would be, but it was real, built on acceptance of past harm and acknowledgement of shared loss. 5 years after Marcus's return, on an October morning bright with autumn sun, he stood at the quarry's edge with Owen beside him, now 12 and already showing signs of the man he'd become. They were marking the completion of a new section, carefully extracted stone ready for processing, and Owen had been given the honor of making the final cut. The boy worked confidently, following the natural breaks in the stone, and when the sections separated cleanly, Marcus felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with legacy continuing. Owen belonged here in ways that transcended residence, was connected to this land through more than just legal inheritance. "Good work," Marcus said simply, and Owen nodded, understanding that praise from his father meant something precisely because it was earned, not given freely. They walked back to the house as the sun climbed higher, past the garden that was beginning its autumn fade, past the equipment shed where Raymond's tools still hung in ordered rows, past the memorial platform where photos and drawings accumulated like physical prayers. The land stretched out around them, 15 acres that had demanded everything and given back more than Marcus had known how to receive. He thought about the letters Raymond had sent, about the 15 years of attempted connection that had finally found its mark, about how sometimes the longest path is the only one that leads home. He thought about Owen, growing up with dirt under his nails and stone dust in his lungs, learning legacy not as burden but as privilege. He thought about all the things Raymond had never said aloud but had written into the land itself, messages of protection and trust and the stubborn insistence that some things matter more than ease or comfort. The quarry would continue after Marcus was gone, would pass to Owen and perhaps to Owen's children after that, each generation adding their chapter to a story written in stone and silence and the patient work of hands. The land would remember them all, would hold their efforts in layers of limestone and enriched soil and the modified deposit that defied geological explanation. As they reached the house, Owen ran ahead to wash up for lunch, and Marcus stood for a moment longer, looking back at the quarry. Raymond's grave was in the town cemetery, a simple marker that noted only his name and dates, but Marcus knew his grandfather's real memorial was here, in the living operation that continued his work, in the land protected and preserved and passed forward with care. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly to the empty air, to the memory of a man who'd loved through distance and silence, who'd trusted that someday understanding would bridge the gap abandonment had carved. "I get it now. Took me long enough, but I finally get it." The wind moved through the quarry, carrying the scent of stone and earth and the promise of seasons yet to come. The land breathed around him, patient and enduring, holding its secrets and its gifts, waiting for the next person who'd need what it offered, who'd understand that some inheritances require you to become worthy of them rather than simply claiming them as your due. Marcus turned toward the house, toward Owen's laughter floating through the open windows, toward the life he'd built from ruins and revelation. The quarry stood behind him, solid and real, proof that legacy wasn't what you inherited but what you protected, what you added, what you passed forward enriched by your presence but recognizable in its essence. The Bennett land. For generations of stone and struggle, silence and survival, secrets kept and slowly revealed. And Marcus understood, finally, that he was neither the beginning nor the end of that story, but a necessary chapter in something larger than himself, written in a language that only those willing to stay and work and trust could learn to read. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.